So lesson 2, take 2, we're going to talk about acute stress disorder and PTSD in this section. Acute stress disorder is the preceding or the less severe when it comes to trauma diagnoses anyway. You're far more familiar with PTSD. It's been in the media and in our culture now for quite some time. Acute stress disorder, though, may be far more applicable in many cases, and this is just my opinion of the matter. But when you look at the level of symptoms that go on here, and again, look at your link there as we follow along here with the diagnostic criteria. So in this particular case, acute stress disorder, the exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, sexual violation, and one or more of the following, and then it gives a whole bunch of different cases there. So typically, acute stress disorder will be a reaction to a really, truly severe trauma. Could be a single event, or it could be multiple events. Again, we've discussed this earlier. Something where you've directly experienced the event, or that you're witnessing in person the events as it occurred to others. So let's say you've watched an event that wasn't something that impacted you directly, but other than from you as the observer of the event, etc. So I want you to look at this diagnostic criteria very closely. I think it's interesting there must be present 9 or more of the following symptoms in any of the 5 categories. So we have everything from intrusion symptoms, negative mood, dissociative symptoms, avoidance symptoms, and arousal symptoms. And so we're looking at all of those things to try and come up with an appropriate diagnosis regarding acute stress disorder. Let me dig a little bit deeper into here. So you also see duration of the disturbance, 3 days to 1 month after after the person was exposed to the trauma. Symptoms typically would begin immediately after the trauma, but persistence must be up to 3 days, up to a month in order to meet this disorder criteria. So the disturbance would also need to cause significant distress or impairment in several areas. Could be social, could be occupational, so at work, or other areas of functioning as well. And again, this criteria goes on and on. Now, again, this is just exposure to what these diseases are, mental health disorders are in terms of response to trauma. Acute stress disorder, probably far more common in our society than we give it credit for. It doesn't have quite that familiarization with us culturally as PTSD is, and that'll be the very next one. So we're going to hop right over there to PTSD. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, this is one that you're probably more familiar with, at least in our culture. We talk about it a lot more. Over the past many, many years, we've certainly seen a lot of this in the media, with the wars having been going on in Iraq and Afghanistan for the length of time that they have. This has certainly caught a lot of our attention. But the diagnosis of PTSD, or for that matter, acute stress disorder, certainly is not limited to that population of folks. It can be properly diagnosed in anyone. If you're looking at the link, the brainline.org link that I provided there, you're going to see a lot of criteria there. So here's, granted this is from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, but don't think that this is just related to those folks there. In fact, you can see there in the top portion, there's a little bit of information there, and it says that the DSM-5 has introduced a preschool subtype of PTSD for children under the age of 6 years. The criteria below, though, is for adults, adolescents, and children that are older than 6. So that's what we'll be looking at there. So look through this. Criterion A, stressor. Criterion B, intrusion symptoms. Criterion C, avoidance. Criterion D, negative alterations in cognitions and mood. Criterion E, alterations in arousal and reactivity. Criterion F is the duration, G is the functional significance, and H is looking at exclusions, and there are 2 specifications we'll get down there in a minute. Let me look back at the very beginning of this. So you've got the stressor occurred. It can either be from a direct exposure to the stressor, meaning that it directly impacted you. You were involved in that traumatic event. You were sexually abused. You were physically abused. You were involved in that car crash. You were in a war setting and experienced a trauma related to that war setting, etc. Or it could be from witnessing it. Maybe you were not directly impacted by the event, but you witnessed it. Maybe you witnessed that car crash and you saw something that impacted you in that way. Perhaps you were the witness to maybe family trauma or something along those lines. Those types of things. And or learning that a relative or close friend was exposed to a trauma. Indirect exposure to aversive details of the trauma. Still, this is something that we need to stop and talk about, because in a sense, we're not necessarily first responders in the sense that we're going to be playing the role of police or firefighters or medics or something of that line. But as providers of mental health services, we definitely have secondary impact on our own lives, and that is something that you need to be aware of. We will certainly discuss later on more details about setting healthy boundaries for ourselves as providers of services, but we're going to be impacted by the trauma of other people. It's secondary exposure to trauma, and you care about your clients. I hope you do anyway. We tend to be drawn to these career fields as counselors because we do care. And as a caregiver, you're going to be exposed to the trauma of other folks. Anyway, just something to be aware of. The intrusion symptoms, one has to be required here so you can kind of see through those. We're very familiar with flashbacks and nightmares, but they can come in other ways as well. So upsetting memories and physical reactivity after exposure, or emotional distress, which is a fairly broad context there. Avoidance, so we can look at things like that regarding avoidance, but again, one is required for proper diagnosis. Two are required under D, which are negative alterations in cognitions and mood. You can look through those. Alterations in arousal or reactivity. Again, nothing specifically has to be in terms of numbers. You don't have to meet a specific number of criteria here regarding symptoms, but certainly you should be making note as a counselor of which of these issues your client may be going through. The duration, of course, is listed there of a minimum of 1 month, but symptoms last oftentimes far longer than that. And then you have functional significance, which is required. And then you're going to want to look at the exclusions, because obviously you want to know enough about your client to know what medications they may be on. Are they substance users? So is this, are these symptoms brought on perhaps by substances or any other illnesses, okay? Two specifications you see there at the bottom: the dissociative specification, depersonalization and derealization. And then the other one is delayed specification, okay? So be familiar with those as well. So this is PTSD and what has to take place in terms of satisfying that diagnosis. Regarding acute stress disorder or PTSD, the issue here is, how do these impact folks in our culture today? What percentage of your clientele may be exhibiting symptoms of either of these disorders? Your familiarization with the diagnostic criteria, with the symptoms of these, can help you as a clinician in terms of forming that alliance with your client so that you can be better prepared to help them. Okay, and that's the purpose of us going over these.